establish the relevance of this, I've been seeing some stuff in the paper. I don't really follow campaigns and elections very closely, right? But I've seen stuff about Steve Bannon and the whole issue of keeping really close tabs on precincts and making sure that ballots as they come in are tracked more completely and so on. So really what's the context of this? For people who haven't really been keeping up really closely with it, what is the state of the debate over election integrity right now?
Well, one of the things that I think really brought this conversation back in the last few weeks has been the initial shoots of documentary 8,000 Mules, which kind of focuses narrowly on the question of kind of these bulk election drop boxes and the role that a left-aligned nonprofits kind of collected bulk ballots mailed out because of the emergency situation of COVID, and that you had these mules that they call them, depositing multiple ballots in these drop boxes at various odd times of the night, and that this is a larger critique of, again, the particular situation of the 2020 election that still a large percentage of the population, including Republicans, see as legitimate, which I think is interesting to the larger dynamic of the perception of legitimacy of these governing institutions, right? And I think that creates some very interesting dynamics in the larger political conversation. But what we've seen is that while some of the other concerns, you had Sidney Powell and Giuliani, kind of in the immediate aftermath of the 2020 election, making claims about voting machines and sort of technical changes, illegitimate sort of votes, illegitimate tabulations, this turns specifically on some of the procedures of handling ballots. And the response legislatively has been various states, usually those Republicans, reining in use of these drop boxes, changing some of the procedures for collecting votes, reining in the kind of bulk mail voting dynamic where everyone's kind of sent a ballot to their registered voter, which is separate from, similar to absentee voting where you request the ballot vote by mail, right? So you've seen this kind of being one of those pet issues of Republicans kind of tightening the process by which ballots are collected and counted for future elections. And of course, these sort of changes have been condemned as Jim Crow style voter suppression, poll tax sort of stuff by all the usual suspects on the left. And Major League Baseball boycotted Atlanta because they made some moderate changes to voter laws last year, and it has put this dovetail into this larger cultural issue where if you believe there's any changes at all to these elected to these elections, you are grouped into whatever the proper term for the far left is of the day in the press, right? And so it's just interesting how really what is just election procedure has really become, I think, one of those very heated topics, separating the left and right to try to build that today.
Well, and of course, it's easy to see why one group would want to ensure that those people who vote are people who are likely to provide an advantage to whoever one's coalition is, right? So it seems the belief is, and it's not overwhelming evidence that high turnout favors the left. I know they often assume that and claim that. Research has come down on both sides. Probably the preponderance, those on the side that higher turnout tends to favor the left. And maybe then the assumption is that just more ballots then favor the left, right? So we just dump a bunch of ballots then at a place and we don't know where they came from and maybe a bunch of dead people voted, then that must favor the left. At least that's what you're going to hear, I suppose, from the right all the time, because every time there's a dispute over voting, of course each side thinks that they're the honest side and the other side is using dirty tricks, right? So from the left's perspective, the right uses dirty tricks by they're expunging people from the voter rolls, and that is somehow dishonest and therefore. And then the right just assumes that wherever these ballots are coming from, that may not be, where there may not be a good paper trail, we just assume it's all for Biden. And they'll regale you with endless evidence about how that's the case, so on. And maybe it is. But the question then is beyond just, oh, do I favor this sort of ballot tracking or these sort of voter registration requirements because it advantages my side? The question is voting good? Do I want to maximize it? Is fewer voters better? And that is totally changed over time from the perspective of the free market people. So when you look at the origins of what today we would cite as the good guys, right? The free market, anti-centralization, anti-autocratic, big government people, they often sided, the people who were the laissez-faire, they often sided with more voting. And why was that? Well, in the 18th century and even really farther back, the government was firmly controlled by basically absolutist monarchs in many cases, or if they didn't rise to the level of monarchs, just more local princes. The Prussian state, for example, not exactly known for its laissez-faire views of business, right? And this proceeded in the 19th century. Bismarck hated the laissez-faire crowd. He referred to people like Richard Cobden as money bags, Manchesterites, right? You know, there's these greedy capitalists who want to come in here and ruin our far more wonderful German culture, which has no time for all that money making. We're more concerned with honor and with the fatherland and all that sort of stuff. So a lot of times these older monarchists hated the liberals and denounced them as unpatriotic because they wanted to make money instead of defend the honor of the king. And so, of course, then the liberals often saw, well, the real interests are with the people who don't want to pay high taxes on bread, which are only there to support the nobility, and the East India Company, and these big corporations that are connected to the monarch that are exploiting the regular people. They're causing the cost of living to go up for regular people. Taxes are high. Taxes are there to benefit the ruling class, which is the monarch's friend. So let's give the vote to more regular people. And so at that time, then, the drive was among the Whigs and the liberals to expand the vote, believing that this would lead to more laissez-faire thinking. And it did, apparently, in the mid-19th century. It was as the vote was expanded, and at least in England, as the reform movements went into the 1830s and 1840s, this undermined the power of the regime, and state taxes did go down, and there was more successful opposition to the imperialist state and so on. But then at some point in the late 19th century, then we began to associate expanding the vote with the left and with the commies. And so it seems to kind of really depend, what is your principle, what is your view of voting? Depends on what maybe the ideological ebbs and flows are. What is the ideology of the common people? If the ideology of the common people, as it was in the mid-19th century, was one toward free markets and toward lower taxes, then sure, you'd want more voting, right? But it seems that now, perhaps through the public schools, the university system, and so on, the working classes, I don't know, the lower middle classes, the belief is that these people all are against free markets and want more government intervention, where I'm not really sure that's true. The most commie people I know are people with graduate degrees. So certainly a lot of the most free market people are like plumbers and people you meet at your parish who are like mailmen and often government employees. They're actually more skeptical of the state than someone who works at Twitter and has a PhD or something. And so I'm not sure that's really it, but there doesn't seem to be like a real, well, if you're a classical liberal, if you're a favor of laissez-faire, you have to be for or against elections. That seems to just depend on historical context.
I mean, the last lecture in particular kind of highlighted this very interesting conflict between the assumption that high election turnout is somehow an inherently left-wing phenomenon. Because even though Trump lost the presidential race, you had Republicans overperform congressional races, exceeded a lot of expectations in state races, and so the down ballot side of things, Republicans won a few Senate seats that some people didn't think they were going to get. You have that dynamic where Biden won the presidency, but Republicans underperformed down ballot with an environment of very, very high voter turnout broadly. But I think this kind of goes to a very interesting dynamic here, where it goes to the dangers of kind of homogenizing American political trends as a whole. Not only is there great differences between regions and states, things like that, but the dynamic between like rural and urban voters. Because like one of the things that the Dinesh D'Souza movie kind of emphasized is sort of a modern day sort of political machine. That you have this ecosystem of Mark Zuckerberg funded or George Soros types, NGO money designed within the cities, Atlanta and Fulton County, Georgia, Phoenix, Arizona, Minneapolis. That their mission of these nonprofits, under the cover of securing democracy in the emergency situation of COVID, they wanted to amplify certain demographics within the city, and that is where kind of the bulk collection of ballots became a big part of that, because they were paying these people to collect these ballots in bulk, which I think even most of the election law, right, were explicitly collected. You can only deliver for family members and things like that, and that was not going on there. Whereas you had at the same time very, very high turnout in non-urban areas, and I think that is kind of this backlash to it's not the absolute monarch anymore, but it is very much sort of this that wants to, force you to wear the LGBTQ ribbon, right, and to be okay with a man in a dress teaching your kids in preschool, and that there's a cultural, I think, resistance to that from graduate school alumni that is creating this interesting dynamic where even though perhaps some of the economic issues haven't changed, now that we're dealing with $5-6 gas, economics might play a bigger role than it may have in the 2020 election when everyone's still kind of flush with truck books and that sort of dynamic there. But I do think you're seeing kind of a broad mass rejection of the very politicized cultural state of the left, and that is why the concerns are, I think, particularly about the way that cities are handling elections. And it kind of reminds me of the degree to which, back in the day, the Republican machines of New York and some of these bigger cities, the way that they relied upon like Irish immigrants as a very key part of the voting bloc, and because a lot of them worked for the big wigs and things like that, so they were going to make sure that they voted right along the lines of the people that they're working for. And I think we see some of the dynamics play out, some of the arguments being made in the D'Souza movie, regardless of whether or not you take a face value, the argument would be, if you think about the Somali population in Minnesota, many of which are relying upon a similar sort of network of NGOs and things like that, that has a role as well in sort of maximizing a very particular type of turnout that is very much deliberately aimed at, if not cynically so, a very specific political lens. That's I think parts of these conversations that are definitely missed, where either one side that all high turnout is voter fraud and dead people voting. The other side, there is no problem at all. More voting is necessarily a good thing. I think in this case, even the D'Souza movie, most of the arguments were not fraudulent ballots. They weren't dead people. It was the improper handling and bundling of legal ballots, and certain people motivated and possibly coerced by some of these kind of machine-style tactics.
And so this brings us back then to the issue of why should you care then about who is voting? And there's no clear laissez-faire liberal principle here, right? Obviously there are issues of fairness and following the rules, and that's good, but those are just general values that there's no clear connection then to just being laissez-faire liberal or being free market or anything like that. And I think we could all agree then that you don't want dead people voting, that you don't want people who've already voted once to vote 3 more times. But you could even come to agreement on that and still end up then with a system where you have a bunch of people voting who maybe shouldn't be voting based on some other principle. And I think the principle that the old liberals were holding to was you shouldn't have non-productive people making decisions about how state resources are used and spent. And that was, I think, the real question there, because early on the idea was we as the bourgeoisie, the productive people, are producing all the new good stuff with industrialization and innovation, and then the monarchs are just stealing it all and giving it out to their friends. So therefore we want to distribute the power among the productive people, and that's us, the middle class. But over time then that clearly became less the guiding light of who should be voting, and it became more a principle of, well, whoever's subject to the rules of the state should be voting, or just if you happen to live in a geographical area should be voting. And that seems to be the dominant idea now. So the question then is, what do you do to control those rules and to enforce them? And as you noted, right, you then get these just cultural disputes over who's controlling the election and who's collecting the ballots, and do I want the other side to have access to that sort of political power? And I think we could look then that it's not necessarily tied to either side, right? Because again, as we often come back to the Jeffersonians, they were very good at getting people to vote and gaining power through that means. It absolutely has not been proven to be the case historically. It's just say the 1870s that new immigrants were going to be voting against free markets, because the Democrats were very good at bringing in new immigrants, and the Democrats were the free market party back then. And they wanted decentralization, and they wanted more local control over markets, and they did not want bankers controlling everything or federal regulation over everything. So a lot of the assumptions today about who should be voting and who should not be voting from the right wing's point of view historically haven't really necessarily played out. And so I guess what you're left with then is, well, the minimum we can agree on is a good thing. It's just that people should follow the rules. And maybe you have to fall back on ideology or something else then to really just deal with the other factors there.
And of course, the rules in this case, at least in theory, dictated by 50 states, not the feds, right? And I do think that there were some interesting arguments about the way those rules were handled in 2020, because you had situations where the state constitution says election laws have to go to the legislature, right? But the governor uses either emergency orders, using the excuse of COVID to kind of rewrite things. And I think that this dynamic, I think, is interesting because you get to this point where, again, if you accept the argument that democracy legitimizes state power by being a demonstration of self-determination at the ballot box or whatever, that justification depends upon a level of integrity within that system measuring that support. In much the same way, like I think it's similar to the dynamic where if the justice system presents a legitimate use of state power based off of the way evidence is presented, once you break down that kind of chain of custody on what lends itself to being the underlying justification for the exercise of state power, the lack of any sort of custody control, as for the person who's bought ballot box, I think is a very valid argument, even if you're not the biggest Sousa fan. What's more interesting, though, is that regardless of the theoretical arguments about political legitimacy, the fact that this issue has become such a heated left versus right aspect of this broadening culture war, I think demonstrates the breakdown of the sacrosanct idea of American democracy, right? Because if the idea is that the electoral process legitimizes state power because it shows what the public wants, and then you have one side recognizing that no, I don't care if Joe Biden got 80 million votes. I am not okay with policies X, Y, and Z, and I don't only disagree with them, I hate them, and they are hostile to me in my views. Then there is no thing in the need. There is no sentence of, at least he's my president. I don't like the man, but I respect the office. We're seeing is the breakdown of respect for the office, and that's where I think this dynamic, and of course, as pointing out that democracy is the loser's game in politics, but the left rejected the legitimacy of the 2016 election based off the Russia collusion arguments too. And I know that you've talked in the past, you've given some great talks about the way in which democracy really does, I guess, is just the justification for whatever those in power want to do anyway. The fact that I think normal people are waking up to the idea that it doesn't matter how hard they vote, the deep state regime is going to march on, stepping in their face and getting $6 gasoline and depriving them of the life that they have grown accustomed to in modern America. Simply being able to point to the political process as justification for these things is not going to work. And likewise, I think that if you end up getting, I think that you're going to see the left argue. I have no doubt that they'll claim that DeSantis is sort of rigging things in Florida because of just how obviously wrong how horrific his education policy is, which is detrimental to a certain minority group or something like that, right? Both sides are no longer playing this game that we're going to solve our problems through figuring out who can persuade most people in elections. It is a recognition that these are two just powers at that war, and I think this is something that's not going to go away. It doesn't matter how secure, it doesn't matter what election laws you pass. If Joe Biden wins the 2024 elections, the most strict rules Republicans put in place is not going to give the Republican voters confidence that he is a legitimate president by any means.
Well, maybe that's one reason, too, you want to drive up total vote numbers, no matter where they're coming from, right, is that you have this belief that it somehow legitimizes the regime if a lot of people are voting. And that's one of the greatest coups, I think, that's been employed by pro-regime types, people who believe in large, expansive, interventionist states, is that they keep telling people that, yes, well, look at all these people participating in democracy. Isn't that wonderful? Doesn't that show how legitimate our government is? And even a lot of people who fancy themselves as anti-regime, they buy into that pro-regime ideology, right? Nobody believed that in the 18th century, that voting was a means of showing your support for the regime. The purpose of elections was to provide a veto against the powers of the regime. Elections were a veto process. They weren't a let's show our support for the regime process. And you can see that even people on our side have completely forgotten that aspect of it. They now completely buy into this idea that voting is necessarily pro-regime. Is because you'll hear that argument that just voting means you support the regime, which, no, that's a completely new idea. If voter turnout is humongous, I could just as easily argue that voter turnout is humongous because people are so afraid of the regime and hate it. Because lots of people vote based on fear, right? They're not voting their aspirations and their hopes. And boy, has that been proven right a million times, right? I remember Hubert Humphrey, gave some dumb speech about how you can't vote your fears, you have to vote your hopes. He was hoping to defeat Nixon. And guess what? Everybody turned out and voted their fears because they were afraid of street violence. And Nixon ran on a law and order policy. And so he was wrong. People largely vote their fears. So if you have huge turnout, it means people are afraid of the other guy. It means they they fear that the power of the regime is going to be used against them. So I don't see how we can assume that high voter turnout somehow lends legitimacy to the state, especially when it's a 50-50 vote, and all that does is demonstrate that people hate each other, as you're doing. But in the past, elections were more frequent for that reason. It was believed that state power was so abusive, you needed annual elections to help provide some sort of veto on state power. And so in America, in the 19th century, the late 18th century, annual elections, sometimes elections even every 6 months were more common. And you had very few governorships where they had a 4-year term. That's like a 20th century thing too, where we decided governors need 4-year terms. But right up until the 70s and 80s, tons of governors still had 2-year terms. But what you hear now from people in these right-wing types are like, oh, we don't want more elections. Those are expensive. We should just we should give politicians more years to do horrible things, because what, you want me to vote every year? Well, yeah, if you were John Adams, you thought annual elections were great and the only way to really control state power. Somehow we bought into this dumb idea that elections necessarily give power to the regime, and you shouldn't have them very often, because if you have them annually, that somehow gives even more support to the regime. That would have been a totally bizarre point of view to the people who wrote the Bill of Rights, the Anti-Federalists, those sorts of guys.